Major funding for these broadcasts is made possible by grants from Chase Commercial Term Lending and New York Community Bank, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Capital One Bank, the Wyckoff Group, Genova Burns, Giantomasi Webster, Greenberg Traurig. Additional funding is provided by grants from AKA Hotels, Corman Communities, Ariel Property Advisors, AVR Realty Company, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Bank Leumi USA, Briarwood Organization, CBRE, Citizens Bank, Colliers International NYC, CPEX Real Estate Services, Cushman & Wakefield, Customers Bank, DDG, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development Levine Builders, Fisher Brothers, First Nationwide Title Agency, Flushing Bank, Foley & Lardner, Friedman LLP, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, HAP Investment Developers, Herrick Feinstein, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Chairman USRealty.com, John Katsimides, Red Apple Group, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Madison Realty Capital, Massey-Knackle Realty Services, Matone Group, Mercantile Commerce Bank, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, New Banks, MHP Real Estate Services, People's United Bank, SJP Properties, Sterling National Bank, Sterling Risk, Stonehenge Partners, TD Bank, Terra CRG, The Continuum Company, CUNY TV Foundation, The Moynihan Group, Urban American, and These Friends.
A limey, an individual who came from London, an individual who went to Cambridge, London School of Economics, some summers working in a chicken farm, working in some vineyards, J.P. Morgan, Chase Manhattan Bank, gets involved with consulting and subsequently decides to own a vineyard? Not a vineyard, one of the premier vineyards in Long Island. I have Peter Carroll today. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Go back to your grandfather, your great-grandfather. The stevedore on one side and the other.
Yeah, my mother's parents were working-class Londoners from the East End. My grandfather was a dock worker, stevedore, I guess, longshoreman, I think you would call it. And on my father's side, his father was a color sergeant in the Royal Marines.
So he had the military. He was a full sergeant. This was in between World War I and World War II?
Yes, so my grandfather, on my father's side, I think he fought in the Boer War, but he didn't fight in the Second World War. Right.
So he was in the Boer War. And now, where did your grandparents live in the United Kingdom?
Well, they moved around because they would get based different places. But my father was born in Chatham in Kent, which is a Royal Marine base, and then grew up in Suffolk. In fact, if you go to Suffolk County, my dad was grew up in an area, a town called South Wold, and the people from South Wold moved to Long Island, and the town of Southold was originally founded by people from that town.
So that's one side of the family. And where are the stevedores located?
They were in Dagenham, which is part of East London.
Now, your father enlists in the military during World War II?
He enlisted just before the war. He had an older brother who joined what was originally the Royal Flying Corps, became the Royal Air Force. And my father admired his older brother, so he joined the Royal Air Force.
And your father becomes a pilot for the Royal Air Force?
He was actually a radio operator, a role that has gone away.
Okay, he was a radio operator,
yeah.
And what happens is one day they're at a party or at a wedding?
Yes, my parents met because they were both guests at someone else's wedding during the war. This was about 41, I think. And during the reception after the wedding, there was an air raid, and everyone hid as best they could. And a nearby bomb, though the building wasn't hit, but a nearby bomb caused part of the ceiling to collapse. And at that point, my father and my mother were sheltering under a large wooden table, and that's actually
so that was how they met. And then we have that nice picture of your parents' wedding, your father wearing his full military dress over there. So they get married during the war.
Yeah.
We're not sure. You have to check with your great aunt over there for a specific date.
43, I think it was.
In 1943. And where's your mother living when he's in the Royal Air Force?
She lived in East London. She did 2 or 3 jobs during the war. She was a bus conductor, and she worked for a butcher for a while, but then she volunteered and she became a nurse or an assistant, and she wasn't a fully qualified nurse. But
so the war ends, your father comes back, and then he goes to work
civilian,
yeah, but also in the Air Force, working in the
air, yeah.
In the air.
He worked for a company that's disappeared now, but it was called Airwork, and they operated charter flights around the world. But it was a very different world. So he would go away on a trip, say, to Cape Town, and the way you got to Cape Town in those days was
with 3 flights, probably.
Well, several. You actually left London and flew to Basel in Switzerland, where you stopped for lunch. And then in the afternoon, you flew to Rome, where you slept overnight in a hotel. And anyway, it took about 5 days to get to Cape Town.
Besides the stevedore and the military, what was the relationship of your family to being in the pub business that we were talking about?
That's a good question. Somewhere in the midst of time, both on my mother's side and my father's side, there was something of a pub tradition. In fact, my grandparents on my father's side ran a pub in Suffolk for a while. The name of which I can't remember, but it was something like the Beehive, I think. But on my mother's side, they were a very extensive pub family all over London.
You see, but people, when they think of the pub, what you told me before the show is that the pub was really owned by the brewery.
Yeah.
The beer brewery, I assume?
Yeah, yeah.
So the brewery, basically, if we had to utilize the comparison to the gas station, the mechanic store, Mobil, Texaco, Citgo owned the gas station, and they leased it to a family, being your grandparents, and then subsequently your own parents. And in this place, it would be an operation. They'd pay rent, but in essence, it was owned and built by the beer manufacturer.
Right.
They were able to sell other beers, but it was, it was predominantly, let's say, Bush, because it was a Bush, whatever the...
Yeah, Watney's was the one that my parents had. Yeah, that was exactly how it was. I would say that out of every 100 pubs, probably well over 95 were what they called tied pubs, because you were tied to the brewery. The ones that weren't, the very small number that weren't, were called free houses, for the obvious reason that they were free to sell anybody's beer.
Now, when you were growing up, did you work? You and your brother worked in the pubs? Doing what type of odd jobs?
No, serving beer. I didn't like it. I always felt awkward.
Oh, you mean the pitchers? Pitchers of beer, or
no? Like we'd have barrels with taps on them, and you'd serve a pint of beer and take the money and put it in the till. But I usually only did that on special occasions, like New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve, not on a regular working day, school day.
So let's talk about growing up in London. What did you do growing up? You went to school?
Sure. Actually, when I was born, we lived right next to what is now Heathrow Airport. But when I was about 4, we moved down to Sussex, near the coast. So I actually grew up in the country, although it was only 40 miles from London. And that's where my parents' pub was. So pretty normal, went to a state-run school.
Yes, we have that picture of you in that class.
Right, that's right, in the back. Pretty normal stuff, just did that. And then at the age of 11, went to what used to be called a grammar school. Back in that era, students in England at the age of 11 were divided out either into a more academic type of high school or a more vocational school. And so I went to the more academic school, as did my brother. And then at the end...
So you graduated high school, what, at 16?
No, 18.
At 18, and then you decided to take the year off. And you came to
the U.S.
And what do you do?
I had a 3-month pass on the Greyhound bus system, which was very popular back then. I think it cost something like $99 to travel as far as you could.
So you arrived in New York,
Yep.
and you ended up in California.
Yeah, I came with a friend. We came by ship, oddly enough, on a freighter in February, which was a hair-raising experience. We got here on my birthday, March the 4th. That would be, gosh, what year was that?
57?
No,
67.
67, 68, somewhere in there, yeah. And we made so it was March, early March, and geniuses that we are, we decided to go to Canada. So we got to Canada, and it was bitterly cold. We'd never experienced cold like that. And so we turned right around and took a bus to Miami Beach, hung out in Miami for a while, and then gradually went across the country to the west.
Now, when you're in the West, you get a job in a chicken farm, correct?
Yes, we ended up in the Napa Valley, and the Greyhound bus system lost one of our backpacks. And so while we were waiting for the backpack to reappear, which it did after a day or two, we would go back and check at the Greyhound bus terminal. And there was a young lady who worked there, and we became friendly with her. I'm still friendly with her today. She and her husband invited us to stay with them, and then they got us a job, and they found us a job at the Drosky Chicken Ranch.
And so this was a chicken manufacturer who was selling chickens which were then slaughtered, I assume.
I can't remember now whether it was for eggs or for birds, or both, but yeah, that's basically what it was.
And your job over there was you were taking care of the waste as well?
Chicken manure, yes.
Chicken manure.
Yeah.
And then how do you elevate yourself to end up at a vineyard?
Well, we basically exhausted, we finished shoveling the chicken manure, so we worked ourselves out of a job. That job was great, though, because it came with accommodation. So we were paid $2.80 an hour, which to a young English lad seemed like a fortune. It was about
Plus accommodations.
plus accommodation, although we were stuck way up in the hills. So
Didn't matter, you got
no,
accommodation.
that was good.
So then how do you end up?
Well, our friends, Pete and Jenny Baldwin, Jenny being the one from the Greyhound terminal, they found us another job with Dick Steltzner, who has a winery in the Napa Valley. And at that time, he was a vineyard manager. He looked after other people's vineyards.
So what was your first job in the vineyard?
If I remember right, it was banging in redwood posts, which gives you lots of splinters.
Did you learn anything about the grapes at this time?
Not really. It hadn't become the idea for something to do.
So you finish the 1 year, you go back to the UK,
Yes.
and you enter Cambridge.
Right.
And Cambridge you did in 3 years, and in between year, between school, you go back to the Napa Valley to work at the vineyard again.
Except for the first summer. The first summer was '69, and I always remember that because I hitchhiked with a friend to Greece, and it was while we were there on the island of Crete that the U.S. landed Armstrong on the moon.
And which related because you were studying engineering at this time. So you were going to study for engineering. So you finish your 3 years, and then what happens? You graduate from Cambridge.
Right.
What's
so
your decision? Do I go back to the vineyard? Do I get a real job? What?
Right. So in '71 is when I graduated, and what was happening in Britain at that time? Britain, in a lot of things, ends up copying the United States. So in one way that they copied the United States was in the matter of business schools. So there really hadn't been any business schools, but there was one founded in London, probably in '66 or so. And there was a story going around, which was, well, when you graduate with your engineering degree, you can get a job with X, Y, or Z company, and they'll pay you about £1,300. That was the going rate, if I remember. But if you graduate with an MBA, you can get a job paying over £3,000. So we all thought, well, that sounds like a pretty good deal. So 3 or 4 of us applied to and went to the London Business School. So that was straight from university.
So you go to the London Business School, and what do you do during the first year? It was a
I go
2-year
back
program.
to California.
You go back to
Yeah.
California once again.
Yeah, I think between the university and the end of business school, I probably came back to the States 3 or 4 times.
So now you graduate, and you're no longer an engineer. You have a degree, you have your master's in business. And how do you find out about the world of Chase Manhattan Bank?
Well, you know, most schools, even then, had recruiting processes that that basically spoon-feed the students, to be honest, at introducing them to potential employers. But having gone straight from university to business school without any other work experience, the options were somewhat limited.
Or you could have gone back to the vineyard.
That's true. That's true. That would have been vocational education. I'd gone down the grammar school.
So you were accepted into the management training program or the credit training program at Chase Manhattan Bank.
Yep.
in London, and then the second year, after the first year, you get the opportunity to once again return to New York at this time.
Yes.
To work at what, 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza?
Yes.
In credit training.
Yep.
So you arrive in New York City, and then it's like 5 months later they say to you, Peter, it's time for you to go back to the UK. Now, you didn't have a green card. You had a
H3 training visa.
So H3 training visa, which allowed you to stay here, and if you didn't have the job, how do you remain?
Well, the H3 training visa was tied to the employer. So when Chase asked me to go back to London, I said I didn't want to go. And after the pleasantries were over, they said, well, you have to go. And I said, well, I don't have to do anything. And they said, no, you do, because your H3 training visa is tied to us. So if you leave us or we fire you, you won't be able to stay. And I was bullheaded enough to say, well, let me sort that out. So they fired me. And there I was. I was what is known in the immigration law business as a non-legal alien.
And how do you remain in America? I know you got a job as a real estate agent temporarily.
Right. Well, so the distinction between a non-legal alien and an illegal alien has to do with your status when you cross the border. So in my case, I was perfectly at liberty to stay. I wasn't breaking any laws, provided I sought to regularize my immigration status. So I did. I basically applied for a green card.
You applied for a green card in what year was this?
That would have been 74, and I got it in 76.
And you're getting your citizenship in 2015?
Next Friday.
Oh, 2014. Okay, right. Took a couple years. So let's move on to the next thing. So now you're unemployed. You're a real estate broker, which you really didn't love, and you find an opportunity that you saw. We're not sure if it was the New York Times. It definitely wasn't the internet. You find an opportunity with a consulting company. And what was the opportunity?
It was just a job as a consultant with a consulting firm. I obviously knew about management consulting as an occupation, not least because some of my good friends out of business school had joined the Boston Consulting Group, which is a big and very well-known and very good firm. Back then, it was more or less in its early days, and it was very well reputed. So I knew of consulting.
So you got to work for a company which is a division of Dun & Bradstreet.
It was a subsidiary of Dun & Bradstreet. It was called William E. Hill and Company. And people in England used to think that was hysterical because there's a huge chain of bookmakers in England. You know, Ladbrokes and William E. Hill are the two big
So they thought you went into the book.
They thought I was a bookie, yeah. But no, it was actually a management consulting firm. And shortly after I joined, but not because of that, Dun & Bradstreet sold William E. Hill to a Chicago company called Robert H. Hayes, and we became Hayes Hill, and I stayed there for 10 years.
I mean, you're a partner at Oliver Wyman, but is that when you got involved with more of the bank consulting?
Not really. Hayes Hill Consulting was pretty eclectic. I did a couple of projects in financial services, including one just before I joined Oliver Wyman for J.C. Penney. I don't know if you remember that era.
Right, when they were doing the financial services.
Yeah.
So you're at Hayes Hill, and then you have an opportunity to go to work for Booz Allen.
Right.
And they offered you a principal, but not a partnership.
Right.
So you decide to stay at Hayes Hill, and a couple of guys who were part of Hayes Hill,
Alex Oliver and Bill Wyman, yeah.
They decide, what year did they decide to go out on their own?
That was 1984.
So they create a company called Oliver Wyman, and you joined them as a partner in 84.
85.
85.
Yeah.
And, now, during this period of time, 85, how do you find, I realize Suffolk and Suffolk County and South Hode, how do you end up in West Hampton Beach?
Actually, for the same reason that most young people of that age ended up there. It was a place where we would all go and rent a summer house.
So when did you enter, your first time you get to West Hampton Beach?
That was probably in 77 or 8, and that's where I met my wife in 79 at a discotheque, which for people who know me is very unusual. It's like
So
have two right feet.
1979, you buy a house over there, and then you fortuitously sell the house at a profit. And, you know, we're talking about wine country, and it didn't relate to your jobs as a laborer in the Napa Valley, but you say, I have a couple of dollars of profit, and I'm going to buy some land. So
Yeah.
when did you buy land out in the North Fork?
84. Sold the house in West Hampton in 83. Huge profit, $110,000. I thought it was a lot of money, and bought the land, 33 acres of land up on the North Fork.
A potato farm, I assume.
Yep.
And at that time, you found some people to help you, and you started to plant some vines.
Yep, that's right.
And this is 84, and you called it Dorset Farms.
Yes.
Now, you're still being the bank consultant, specializing in financial services. And how do you make the decision later on to buy the Lenz vineyard?
Well, we bought 33 acres, and we started planting the vines. And we were able to put off for a while the question of where would we turn it into wine. Thought that we would do it on site. Later realized that was a huge hassle in planning and building terms. But then we heard that the Lenz Winery, which was about 3 miles away, was for sale.
Now, when was Lenz created?
In about 79.
So he started about the same when you went to West Hampton.
Yes.
And he also on the potato farm?
Yes.
And when you bought the business in 88, how many cases was he producing at that time?
It varied a lot, but I would say around 7,000, maybe 8,000
At that
cases.
time?
Yes.
And at that time, how many acres did he have?
Oh, excuse me, I got that wrong. He only had 30 acres, so he would have been making perhaps half that, about 3,500.
So he had 30 acres, and you had another.
acres.
You had 30 acres. Did you combine the two vineyards together?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, all that means is that at the Lenz location, there's a physical plant, a winery, and a vineyard.
Right.
My
and in
vineyard,
Dorset, you had a vineyard.
just a vineyard.
Just a
But
vineyard.
it's only 3 miles away, so we just drive the grapes over after we pick them.
So, what do you know about winemaking?
A lot now.
I realize, but in 1984 and 1988, what did you know about winemaking?
Not a lot. I knew what I remembered from California, but that was pretty rudimentary. I mean, I just knew about the cycle by which the grapes grew, and you pick them and turn them into wine, but very little.
A lot of distinction. People really considers your wine as one of the best wines in the Norfolk. How has the business changed in the past 30 years?
Well, the Long Island business has changed in two really huge ways. One is it's much bigger. I think when I took over Lenz in '88, there were maybe 10 wineries. Now there are, I've lost track, maybe 50 wineries.
50 gone.
And the total production is much bigger. The second is the quality is much, much higher. Right? If we're honest with ourselves and go back to 1988.
We could have called it Gallo at that time.
Gallo makes some pretty nice wines, actually. But yeah, it was even different than that because the climate and the soils on Long Island were pretty harsh for the founders, and they struggled to adapt to the conditions. Now I think everyone's pretty much figured out how to do that, and now the quality is much, much higher.
Let's talk about family. You have 3 daughters?
I do.
Tell me about them, what their names are, and what do they do?
Lindsay, Meredith, and Allison. That's the oldest to the youngest. Lindsay, she's an engineer, works in D.C., just outside D.C. So she became the engineer that I didn't become, as it were. My middle daughter is a mathematician. She works for J.P. Morgan.
She didn't tell them that you were fired because you didn't...
She hid that from them. And she's worked there successfully for longer than I did. I was only there, I think, for 17 months or something. And my youngest daughter just graduated. She's an architect. She just graduated, and she's working in New York for a small firm of architects.
And besides the vineyard, you like sailing, right? Mm-hmm. How'd you get into that? Your winemaker?
Through my winemaker and my vineyard manager, both of whom over the years have been interested in sailing, and they dragged me along. And to begin with, I just went because they needed extra weight on the boat. And then I realized it was a lot of fun, and this is an incredible area of the world to go sailing. The waters out there and the waves and wind conditions.
So running the vineyard, being a partner in a financial services consulting firm, you make some wine. And today it's about, what, 7,000?
It varies. This year probably 8,500 cases, but somewhere in that range.
If you would have followed your father's footsteps, you could have been in the Royal Air Force.
I thought about it.
You know, that was one opportunity. You know, then it was engineering, so you could have been a space pilot. You know, you could have gone into that field. And really, you know, you had that opportunity in the chicken business. But I think all those summers that you enjoyed, you know, in the Napa Valley really gave you an input to become one of the premier vineyards and winemakers. And thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.